Welcome everyone. We'll get started in just another minute, just letting people filter in here. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome today. My name is Stacy Mitchell. I'm the co-executive director of the Institute for Local Self Reliance, and I'm super excited about today's event. And I'm excited to welcome all of you. We had over 700 people register for this event, which is just incredible. We are making a recording today, so there'll be video of this event that we'll post on our website and our YouTube page, and we will email it out to everyone who registered. So we encourage you to share it with your networks and with people who weren't able to attend today. ILSR's mission is to challenge concentrated corporate power and to build thriving local equitable communities. We've been engaged in energy policy work since our founding in 1974. And if you're interested in learning more about that work, it's really just an incredibly exciting time in the energy sector, a lot of important change going on and a lot of important opportunities. I invite you to check out our Energy Democracy Initiative, which you can find on our website. We publish reports, we produce a weekly podcast and newsletter, and we're very active working alongside grassroots organizations across the country, building coalitions and working to build a equitable, decentralized, democratic energy future. So the reason we wanted to host this event today, because as I said, it's just a really incredible, important moment in the shape of the electricity sector. We wanted to have a conversation about how our electricity system is structured and how the structure that we have now, the structure of investor-owned monopoly electric utilities, which may have made sense 100 years ago, today is really at odds with the public interest, is really working at cross purposes with building a carbon-free future, with rectifying racial inequality, and with building strong local communities and a vibrant democracy. The good news is that there are some just really incredible grassroots initiatives going on across the country in which people are coming up with innovative ways to challenge control by monopoly utilities, and moving towards implementing new policies that would completely restructure the electricity system and really change the structure of ownership, of scale, and decision-making within the electricity system, and do so in ways that would very much align our electricity sector with the public interest. Today's event is a chance to meet some of the cutting-edge leaders and to hear about what they're doing in a number of different places across the country. If you're coming to this conversation because you mainly focus on energy issues or climate issues in your work, I think today's event is going to offer a chance to hear and explore how some of the frameworks and the thinking around anti-monopoly and anti-monopoly policy tools may be useful in what you're doing. And if you're coming to this from doing work on antitrust and anti-monopoly, I think the energy sector is a really intriguing case study, particularly in helping us think about how to govern network industries, how to govern infrastructure. I think there's some really important insights we can glean here as we think about what are the public policies we need to govern new forms of infrastructure, including in particular the tech platforms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. So the run of show today, just to give you a quick overview of how today is going to work, we've got two really terrific panels. Each is going to be about 25 minutes. In the first, we're going to hear from two lawmakers, state lawmakers from my home state of Maine, who led a successful effort in the legislature to pass a law that would allow our dominant investor-owned electric utility to become a consumer-owned electric utility. That law was vetoed by our governor. So the lawmakers we have here today have joined with a set of citizen leaders and are working to put that on the ballot in 2023. It's really an incredible campaign called Our Power. So that'll be the first panel. And then for the second panel, we're going to broaden out and talk to some cutting edge thinkers and advocates who are working to address utility power in other parts of the country, including challenging utility mergers, and using antitrust law to go after some of the predatory things that monopoly utilities are doing. The event ends at 2:15 today, and then we'll bring everybody together for a sort of final short roundup and questions. And throughout today, we are going to be trying to take questions from the audience. And if you've got a question, instead of putting it in the chat, please put it in the Q&A, and we will keep an eye on those and work those into the conversation. So today's event ends at 2:15, but there will be an after party. So we encourage you to stick around afterwards if you like. That after party is going to be a chance to talk to the two leaders from Our Power, from the Maine Initiative campaign. If you want to go more in depth on what they're doing, it's a really interesting campaign. There are lots of opportunities to get involved. And if you want to just learn more about that, just hang on after the event ends officially at 2:15, and we'll transition to having a more intimate conversation with leaders of that. Finally, I want to thank Jess Del Fiacco, ILSR's communication manager, who's been instrumental in pulling together this event. And with that, I'd like to introduce ILSR's other co-director, John Farrell, who is going to moderate the first panel. John is the director of our Energy Democracy Initiative. Welcome, John.
Well, I'm so glad to be here with you, Stacy. And I'm here from my basement office, my COVID retreat. If I'm shivering on screen, it's because it's cold here in Minnesota, -10, but I'm also shivering in anticipation of this conversation, which I've been looking forward to for a long time. What's going on with Our Power and with the other panelists that we'll be talking to is really a transformational conversation that's happening in the electricity sector that is tying into this broader conversation about corporate power. In the electricity sector, and specifically, it's the culmination of almost a decade of exploration by cities, by communities, by states on this idea of who owns the energy system and how can communities have more choice. We've been tracking at ILSR lots of places that have done municipalization campaigns, public power takeovers that have looked at ways that in California and Illinois and other states where cities can take control of energy purchasing. But without getting too much into the weeds, I just have to say that this really, what is being discussed in Maine with Our Power really is transformational in terms of talking about the platform of the utility system as a platform, as this idea, as a place where people might be able to transact, to innovate. Entrepreneurs and businesses could really help us solve the knotty and thorny clean energy and energy reliability and affordability questions of the 21st century. And they're doing that in a really novel and exciting way that I think is the evolution of a lot of these other efforts that have been building up. So I am very pleased to welcome Senator Rick Bennett and Representative Seth Berry to join me for a conversation about Our Power. Seth and Rick, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful to be with you.
I just want to start off by asking a question, sort of the generic question for people who might not be as familiar as I have been in following the Our Power effort. But what is this really about? Why did this idea of a consumer-owned utility that would kind of open access to the grid system? Why did the legislature feel compelled to step in and to restructure the state's electricity market in Maine? And Rick, I was hoping to start with you.
Sure. Well, and I hope you go over to Seth, because Seth really has been the leading light in this amazing battle that has turned into quite an amazing movement in Maine. But I think the reality is that we're undergoing so much change in the world today, right? I mean, people feel lost in the traditional institutions that we've relied on to govern our activities, whether that's in the banking section, sector, the power sector, the university sector, the media. And at the same time, we have an immense opportunity to democratize our decision-making. And so it's interesting that in this area of power, where we need to have a grid which is more responsive and more elastic and more flexible, where electrons are moving in all directions, not just from one big power source out, but from many, many thousands of power sources around and then feeding into the grid. We still have this antiquated system of governing our actual grids, and we rely on these investor-owned utilities in Maine for most, but not all, of the grid management in Maine. And these investor-owned utilities have proven unworthy of the job. And I also have to say, somehow along the line, the main owners and managers of Central Maine Power Company and the old Bangor Hydro, which is now Versant, suddenly we wake up one day and Central Maine Power Company is owned by a Spanish conglomerate named Iberdrola, which in turn is owned, the largest owners of the Norway Oil Fund and the government of Qatar. And the old Bangor Hydro isn't owned in Bangor, Maine anymore. It's owned by the city of Calgary, Canada, 100%. So we have this distant ownership. We have an unresponsive failing on every scale. In fact, the lowest rated power companies in the country because of reliability problems, cost problems. And so we come to this point where this isn't just about electric power, it's about power of people for self-determination to control the grid themselves and make it a grid for the future. So that's what this movement has become, more than just about power, electrical power, but really about political power.
I'd love if you have more to add to that, but also could you talk a little bit about why there's this specific focus on like ownership and control of the grid platform? You know, Rick kind of already alluded to this, that we're talking about sort of absentee ownership in a way, right? You have these utilities, these private companies, they're not even owned by entities that are within the state of Maine, within the United States. In the proposal for that Our Power put forward in the legislation, in the ballot initiative question, it really focuses on this idea of a consumer-owned utility, but that will have open access. Can you talk about how that addresses this issue of power and why that's such an important piece?
Sure. You know, first of all, it's just so great to be here with you, all of you, and I'm honored and proud every time that Senator Bennett and I get to work on this together. I think it's important to note for folks that aren't familiar, Senator Bennett was the president of the Maine Senate in a previous lifetime. He's now the lead on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. He's also on the board of an information internet services provider, a fantastic, scrappy business here in Maine. Among his many other impressive credentials, I come at it from the other side of the aisle. I am a former Democratic legislative leader. So we have in front of you, you have a Republican former state Senate president and a Democratic former House Majority Leader. We have joined in this effort because so much is at stake. And I think, John, your question it goes right to the heart of it. This idea of a non-discriminatory platform provider and this concern about monopoly is pretty hot right now in the information space, right? People kind of get that. They're like, you know, Facebook is taking over. This is a problem. You know, there are two major cable companies and they have a stranglehold. They've agreed not to compete with each other. They have a monopoly in their areas. You know, cell phone services aren't much better. So as we've seen the information highway be purchased and increasing, you know, toll plazas put up on it, and really a huge negative impact on our very democracy, right? Which depends on good information. we're kind of familiar with that, right? That's more in the public eye. But there's this other thing happening, which also has to do with poles and wires, and it is electricity. And I would argue that every bit as much is at stake, because if you think about it, how do we decarbonize, right? How do we save the planet? We all know that the planet is, has very few geological, seconds on the clock left if we don't do something drastic, and that involves electricity. We need to shift to electric vehicles. We need to shift to heat pumps to heat and cool our home. Clean electricity is how we get out of the climate emergency. And all of that needs to flow over the poles and wires. Those poles and wires are a monopoly. And because of the last 150 years or so of the evolution of that industry, we have allowed it, without really thinking about it, without really noticing, we've allowed it to globalize. We've allowed it to conglomerate. We've allowed it to become the province of the few in order to extract value from the many. And so this is about power. It is about money. It's also very much about climate. If we're going to decarbonize, we know that we need to shift to consumer ownership because it works. Because if you look at the first 6 communities in the US, the only 6 that I know of that have actually fully decarbonized, all 6 of them were served by consumer-owned utilities. And I can rattle off the names if you like, but 4 of them are just happen to be in conservative parts of the country. Consumer-owned utilities, by the way, are not a new thing. They serve 28% of America right now. Some are co-ops, which serve the rural areas. They were kind of the last to get service because the big boys didn't want to cover them, wasn't profitable enough. So thank you, FDR. And munis have been around for even longer. They've been around since the very dawn of the electrical era. So between the munis and the co-ops, 28%, those are the places that where they have turned to it, that have decarbonized fully, successfully, gotten to 100% renewable electricity. In the large utility space, I think of SMUD, I think of LA. They're the leaders in getting to 100% renewables as well, and they just happen to be consumer owned. It's not an accident, and it is very analogous to the information space. If you want a utility that isn't intent on preserving and protecting its stranglehold on that highway of electricity, just like the information highway, then you need to have the right motives, the right incentives, and not perverse incentives. Right now, all the incentives are about protecting what they have, maintaining the status quo, making sure that transition is frankly as expensive as possible. And that's not going to help us if we're trying to get there. So I'll stop there, but I have a lot more to say, John.
I'd love to actually get into this a little bit more. One of the things that you've already highlighted in terms of the benefits of this approach is that we can meet some of the climate and clean energy goals that we hold collectively easier. That it's, we have, whether it's in transportation, whether it's in building, heating and cooling, there are all of these different facets of our economy that can run on electricity, and electricity is something that we know how to clean up and make renewable and make low carbon and make low pollution. You kind of referenced this in terms of the way that these businesses operate, right? They're for-profit businesses. They're operating in an environment that encourages them to do certain things and make money in certain ways. Can you tell me about how the flip side of that, how going to consumer ownership brings benefits in terms of trying to get to those broader goals? What are some of the other benefits that you're going to see, whether it's in terms of costs or workers or labor, in using this approach to structuring the utility of the electricity market?
Sure. Do you want to start off, Rick, or should I?
Sure, I'll just jump in with a couple of thoughts, and that is, and this shouldn't be difficult for Maine people to understand, because as Seth said, there are 2,900 municipal or cooperative COU kind of structures serving electricity customers today in the country. Well, in Maine, there are 9 consumer-owned utilities actually serving some of the most rural parts of Maine, Washington and Hancock counties, for example, far down east. Those 97 towns, in fact, are served by consumer-owned utilities, and they have experienced a much better rates on their electricity, 53% less. They've got a much more reliable service, isn't disrupted as much by storms. So I think the proof is already there about the savings that can be achieved and the responsiveness that you can get when you have owners who are the customers, and they are going to insist that the company is run for their benefit, not for the investors in far off lands. And as Seth was also saying, I mean, part of these savings isn't just because people are nicer because they live closer to the utility or the grid. It's because of the way that the finance works. Most utilities, because they've got captive customers, they're natural monopolies. People love to give them very low risk bonding, and so revenue bonds can fund much of the capitalization necessary for modernizing the grid with consumer-owned utilities, and those revenue bonds are currently selling at 2 or 3%. The investor-owned utilities, however, because of Supreme Court decisions from nearly a century ago, starting nearly a century ago, have baked in returns for capital investments, returns on equity of 8 to 12%. With some variations. So because of that differential between the 2 and 3% and the 8 and 12%, there is an opportunity to recapture money that ratepayers are now paying in and have savings in the monthly bill, but also to capture some of that money to update and modernize the grid. So I think that's already been shown. And if people are interested in the impact on Maine, particularly, there's a lot of research available at our website, ourpowermaine.org, in that way.
That's right. And I'll just chime in that we initially began this journey in 2019 with a bill that went before the legislature. That bill turned into a feasibility study, and the Public Utilities Commission contracted with London Economics. Our PUC, by the way, is, they're friendly with the utilities. That's who they see on a day in and day out basis. So we didn't have super high hopes, but and by the way, London Economics, most of their work is for investor-owned utilities. So for that reason too, we weren't super optimistic, but they came back with a clean bill of health. They said, this is, number one, this is constitutional. Yes, you can require that the utility sell to a new consumer-owned utility. And number two, it will save you money. The chances are their reference case, their sort of middle of the road assumption was you might see a little bit of an uptick in rates in the first few years, 5 to 7 years, and then increasing savings, lower rates from there on out, and continuing to get lower. That analysis was then reviewed by a Maine-based energy economist by the name of Dr. Richard Silkman. He took it a step further and said, wait a minute, you forgot to mention there's about $4 billion sitting on the books in a reserve account in your own economic model. So you gotta count that. That belongs to ratepayers, and some other adjustments as well. He said, no, you're going to save $9 billion over the first 30 years alone, which in Maine is a lot. It might not be as much in California, but we're a small state. $9 billion, and that's in savings, net savings, right? Even after you pay down the acquisition. And you will see ratepayer savings from year one. So you can reduce rates, you can invest some of that money, some of that savings in building out the grid and modernizing the grid. And it's a win-win all around. We also, in our proposal, allocate some of that to better pay and conditions for workers. We make sure that the utility is required to use union labor, to invest in local businesses, and provide some protections for workers. They keep their jobs, their benefits. There are 2 collective bargaining units, so they go to the higher one. So it is a win-win all around. And really, you do, as Rick said, you simply do this by displacing a very high cost business model, which has worked okay, I guess, in the 20th century, but is fundamentally broken for the 21st and for the challenges that we face in the future.
Here's one of the things I've been sort of skimming the Q&A, and just want to remind folks that if you have questions, we probably won't get to all of them like every webinar, but we are skimming through them to try to see what we can bubble up. I'm seeing a few folks mentioning this idea of like, well, two threads here. One is, why is public ownership necessarily better? So you mentioned that, Seth, already a couple of places that are doing good. There's also plenty of examples of, publicly owned utilities that aren't necessarily doing great on the measures that we care about, especially around like clean energy. So how are you thinking about that? And the other one I thought was really interesting was, why do you want to buy the grid assets when they may not end up being very useful? And I think those are both good questions, and I'm guessing that you've thought of answers to both of those as part of this.
Yeah, those are great. Do you want me to take that, Rick, or do you want to jump in?
Well, let me just say, I know there are parts of this which you're able to answer better, but I would say that accountability is key here. Okay, and nobody can guarantee performance, but you can certainly guarantee who's accountable for that performance. And right now, as mentioned, we have a broken model. It's built to serve people in distant places, not the ratepayers. And the fundamental thing that we've got with this model, it's not a government ownership model. It is a consumer ownership model. The board would shift from a lot of foreign business people to an ownership model where the board of directors for the nonprofit would be elected. 7 of them would be elected by the people of Maine, and then 6 would be elected by those 7. So you'd have a full board of 13 members, and the 6 that would be elected by the 7 would be people to infill skills gaps. And so we've got this model which doesn't have government ownership. It has no reliability and no reliance, I should say, on the taxpayer. It doesn't have any appointments by the governor or appointments by the legislature. This is an independent, not-for-profit corporation that will then hire a C-suite a C-suite of executives who will run the company. And so you have that level of accountability where the management is hired to do a job by a board that's elected by the people. And so it's a completely different structure for following power and accountability in the structure itself. And I think it's better suited to actually serving the end user, client, and customer.
That's a great answer. And I'll just chime in. Senator Bennett really helped us to give a lot of careful consideration and improvement to the board structure. That is something you absolutely want to pay attention to. It is possible to create a consumer-owned utility that is not well designed, right? And it doesn't have good governance standards. So we included things like, freedom of access. It has to be transparent. Conflict of interest provisions, all of that. The elected appointed hybrid, I think, is a very useful addition as well. But just stepping back a bit, taking it to kind of the highest level, yes, there are these nonprofit consumer-owned utilities and these for-profit investor-owned utilities. And it is true that there are better investor-owned utilities and worse consumer-owned utilities, within those two families, right? They're not all created equal. In a way, I think a business model is like a tool, right? It's potentially a very powerful tool, and the part of the purpose of the investor-owned tool is to make money for shareholders. In fact, it's their number one fiduciary responsibility, right? They would be doing a bad job on the board if that was not their top priority. That is removed from the consumer-owned model. They don't have to worry about profit. Their focus is on people, and perhaps, if you make it so, it's about planet, right? The people part matters. Their number one focus is people. If I'm a consumer-owned utility in rural Nebraska, I might not be asked by my constituents to care about climate. But you know what? If my constituents do ask me to care about climate, I can put my full attention on that. I don't need to think about how I'm going to maximize the future profit of this enterprise. I can go full on to decarbonization, to a just transition, what I like to call a full, fast, fair, and friendly transition, which is in fact what we have to do. It is absolutely critical that we do this. And, the proof's in the pudding. I mentioned the communities that have done it so far. I think that's a good indicator that the business model is the right tool for the challenges that we face today. And do we need to pay attention? Can we create it and then walk away? Of course not. We need to pay attention. Democracy is not a is a participatory sport, not a spectator sport. And a democratic institution like a consumer-owned utility needs tending. So the other question was about why the grid, is the grid kind of I almost took the question to be, is the grid going away in the future? And I don't think it can. I think there are too many lower income, vulnerable communities that can't simply, put a solar panel on the roof and walk away. I think we also have to be cognizant that we use a lot of electricity, a lot of energy right now, not just in electricity, but to displace petroleum, to displace natural gas, to displace number 2 oil, to displace coal. We're going to have to create a whole heck of a lot of grid to interconnect, to avoid situations where an isolated part of the grid goes down like it did in Texas. I mean, you need a robust grid. You need transmission. It's not all local microgrids and distribution, but that is a big piece of it. And by the way, we can do more with decentralized solutions if we do have a consumer-owned model, simply because you don't have that built-in incentive to build out more transmission and get that high rate of return that Senator Bennett mentioned.
I want to make sure that we check in with you to describe where this campaign is at right now in terms of the referendum. I just wanted to add one little piece too. I think that's important for folks to understand about the proposal, which is that the Pine Tree Power Company, this consumer-owned utility, would also have more open access, that it's not the monopoly in the traditional sense of other consumer-owned utilities where it's the only player that can offer services. I think that open access model really changes the nature of it, because the accountability isn't just through your board, it's through the other players. It's through the other folks that are participating that can bring energy services to the system. So with that in mind, tell us a little bit about how this campaign is going. You mentioned that there was work at the legislature. How has that transformed to go to the ballot, and what does that look like? What's that environment like? What's the struggle here, and how what is your hope for it?
Before we do that, John, I just wanted to mention one other thing, which in Maine, as in a lot of other places, there is a separation between this transmission and distribution side of utility and the generation side of utility. We already have separated that years ago in Maine. And so what we're talking about here is the control of the grid itself, which is a natural monopoly, which is the poles and the wires and the transformers and all of those things. And so it's different in other communities where the generation is also part of the mix. So I'll let Seth though talk about where the campaign is at right now.
Yeah, that's a great note, Rick, and I'm glad you brought it up, just to keep people clear. We are looking at generation as well. There's a wonderful book that I'll recommend to people that maps out how generation can be a part of this as well, and even can be consumer owned. But where are we? So I mentioned that in 2019, there was a bill that led to a feasibility study in the following legislature in 2021, with the lead co-sponsor being Senator Rick Bennett, and a wonderful bipartisan team, including actually a independent tribal member as well of the legislature. We put forward a bill. There was a groundswell of support from across the state. People are excited about this. We had overwhelming testimony and support. We then had a vote of the House and a vote of the Senate that in each case was bipartisan and was successful, was more than half, getting it to the governor's desk. The governor didn't then veto it, although she said some nice things about the concept and does clearly have some real concerns about having the worst performing utility in the country, bar none, by every standard: customer satisfaction, high rates, worst reliability in the nation. So she gets that. She just expressed some concerns about implementation. So although we disagreed, we said, okay, Governor, we're going to take it to the people directly. We're going to go out and get the signatures, and that's what we have done. The Our Power Coalition and you can learn lots more at ourpowermaine.org. Has gone directly to the people exercising Maine's constitutional right to the ballot question, the citizen initiative. We have already, just in the last 11 weeks, collected 73% of the signatures needed. So that's a high 40,000s, 46, 47,000 signatures. And that was during the very peak of the pandemic here. Hospitalizations were twice as high as they had been. We had volunteers out in the cold because you couldn't do the signature collection indoors for the most part. No corporate money, a lot of small dollar donations, but it's really been an astonishing, impressive, unprecedented effort. We're very proud of what we've done so far. We are aiming for the 2023 ballot. So it won't be on the ballot this year. It'll be on the ballot next year, 2023. And that gives us a lot of time to educate voters, to finish up with the signature collection. And we hope to network with other like-minded individuals around the country, because I know there are many folks out there working on similar things, including on this call today.
I just want to again thank Representative Barry, Senator Bennett for joining us for this conversation about the efforts in Maine. Remind people that there's an after party for folks who want to learn more about the campaign after this webinar ends in a little over half an hour. Thank you again, and I just want to invite my co-executive director Stacy Mitchell back so we can get ourselves set for our second panel. Thanks again, Seth and Rick.
Thank you, and honored to be with you.
Our pleasure. Hope folks stay on for the after party.
That was terrific. So interesting. I'm really struck, John, about, I think Representative Barry's statement of sort of talking about the importance of figuring out structures that are really aligned, ownership structures that are really aligned with the outcomes that we want to see, but that doesn't obviate the need for nurturing those structures and having democratic oversight. And a really useful, I think, way of framing and thinking about, not only stuff in the electricity sector, but really across the economy and how we think about policymaking. Excellent. And with that, I am going to introduce our next panel, and I'm going to moderate this panel, and John is going to get to join as a speaker on this side. And let me introduce our two other panelists. Really terrific. Marielle Nancy is the executive director of New Energy Economy, based in New Mexico, which works to transform the energy system and foster a just transition to a renewable future. And Jean Su is the Energy Justice Director and Senior Attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, based, I believe, in Washington, D.C. Excellent. Welcome, both of you. I'm so glad you could join. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience, we'll have the second part of the discussion for about 25 minutes, and then all of our panelists are going to come together for a wrap up. And so I want to turn first, I think, to you, John. I was hoping that you could just zoom out a little bit and talk about how it is that policymakers structured the electric utility sector a century ago. That structure may have made sense at the time, I don't know, but today it seems that it's really at odds with what we want to see. And I sort of want to hear, like, what changed, like what's different now, what changed over time. I think that there are people who would say, who may be listening, who are not involved in the electricity sector, who would say, well, these are regulated monopolies with public commissions that oversee them. So doesn't that solve the problem of getting them, of having a functioning sector? So can you give us a little, like, big picture overview?
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful that Marielle and Jean will be here to give specific examples of why that regulatory structure is not sufficient in order to oversee these companies. But when we set on this adventure of building an electric grid, the idea was essentially that in order to build the grid, you didn't want to build 2 grids or 3 grids. It wasn't really a great idea to have a competitive enterprise in terms of stringing poles and wires to all our homes and businesses. And it was going to be enormously expensive, and that you needed a lot of capital to come into the space in order to do that. And so the initial titans of the industry, Samuel Insull was the right-hand man to Thomas Edison, helped to essentially negotiate with state legislatures to say, hey, look, if you protect us from competition so that we have easier access to financing, we can then build out the grid less expensively and serve more people more effectively. So the trade-off will be these companies then get their guaranteed profit. They're overseen by the public, these private companies, but in return, they're going to offer something of high value to the public, which is access to reliable and affordable electricity. And for decades, as long as you are willing to accept the asterisk of sort of the environmental impact that we were ignoring from that model, it worked terrifically. We built, we built out one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century, which is to say we connected most folks to the grid. And thanks to the federal government in the 30s, we also connected rural homes and businesses that were left out from that initial wave. And we built ever larger centralized power plants that were lowering the cost of electricity. So decade by decade, you actually were paying less for electricity than you were the decade before. That all kind of came to a halt in the 1970s, where essentially we ran into the wall of the economies of scale of power plant construction, that it became actually more expensive to build bigger. And that there was a breakdown in the model where folks assumed, who had been in the industry for decades, that energy use would just keep growing and they would always have a market to build more power plants. And so what we sort of been doing is in the last 50 years almost, we're sort of paddling upstream to get the things that we want, whether it's energy efficiency or renewable energy like solar energy, or access to the markets for community solar or other ways of developing energy. All of this is going against the flow of the incentives for the utility companies. And Seth and Rick mentioned this in the first panel. Their incentives are to build more infrastructure to serve the electric customers. And the thing is that we don't need them to build it in the same way that they've been doing it. But we haven't restructured the rules of the market in order to encourage them to do something different, in part because they oppose us and when we try to do that. So we're in this situation right now where we've got 100 years of flow in this river, and every once in a while we're trying to like paddle to the shore or paddle somewhere different, but there's just so much momentum behind it, whether it's the institutional inertia of the utilities themselves or the legal and political power that they have over the decision-making process. And that's led to what were some of these hopeful moments, though, in what we're seeing, whether it's in Maine or New Mexico and Arizona and other places, of ways that we can fight back against that flow.
That's great. Jean, I was wondering if you could just help us think about well, what does that actually mean talk a little bit about some of the examples and ways that you're seeing utility power play out. What are the problems? What are the things that they're blocking and doing at the ground level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one of the premises of the current power system is what people will call a regulatory compact or compact. And what that is essentially is that we gave a ton of private companies a guaranteed monopoly over servicing territories. And with that was, as John was saying, democratizing the grid. We didn't want to build, two just overlapping grids. So with that, the compact was, hey, you've got a guaranteed set of customers, you've got a guaranteed revenue. And in exchange for that, we are actually going to govern you and put, utility commissions to regulate you essentially. And what's happened is that we now have a pretty broken system in terms of regulation. And that have not been able to combat exactly what John was talking about. We have a system where we have pretty significant regulatory capture, where regulators are either coming from the utilities or being guaranteed jobs after with the utility that they are regulating. And it really becomes a situation where we have the fox guarding the hen house in a lot of ways. And the conclusion of all of that and the result is that we don't have a system that's fighting for our public interest anymore. We have a system that is actually benefiting private corporate interests or the utilities' interests. And I'll talk about, we see this in a bunch of different ways. There are significant examples of energy violence that we see in our system. We have a system that is majority fossil fuel right now. And who suffers the most? The disproportionate amount of communities of color in this country who live disproportionately close within 3 miles of a fracked gas plant and a coal plant. Those are the people who are suffering from that dirty energy system. We also have energy violence in the form of unaffordability and energy poverty. We were able to track this year the millions of families who were disconnected during COVID for failure to be able to pay. And at the same time, the increasing shareholder profits that all the top corporate utilities actually made this year. They could have taken just less than 1% of the executive compensation and shareholder returns that they got this year for COVID and put it towards saving the over 1 million households that they cut off, but they didn't. And regulators didn't force them to do that. And I think the last type of energy violence that we're seeing is, of course, the violence that comes from climate disasters. People are unable to actually keep on their connection during hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and heat domes right now. And distributed energy is a way that we can actually make energy truly resilient. All of those pieces are coming together to solidify monopoly power in this country. And it's also stifling the absolute clean energy transition that we need and the rooftop and community solar that we need to combat those types of energy violence and actually work in the public interest.
We've got this situation of, ownership models and market structures that don't work. And we've got a captured regulatory, oversight system, captured regulators. You were involved in a case in Arizona that looked to sort of do an end run around, as I understand it anyway, a relationship between the state's public utility commission and an investor-owned utility there. You were involved in this case that used antitrust policy to actually go after some of the predatory behavior by that utility that had been supported by the Public Utility Commission. Could you just give us, I know there are lots of ins and outs of the case, but could you give us an overview of like what the approach that you took and were trying to do and where the case stands now?
Yeah, so it's great that people are tuning into ILSR, who's at the forefront of thinking about monopolies and how this works. We are at the vanguard right now of applying antitrust law to the utility sector, which for so long has been immune from antitrust bombs. And essentially, just to back up a second, antitrust, the whole point of antitrust, the thrust of creating these laws, was to actually protect our democracy. It was to ensure that corporations did not have greater voice over our democracy than everyday citizens. That is the background, and that's why we need to break up large monopolies, because we don't want our regulators and our politicians to be controlled. So what we're doing right now is seeing how that type of law, antitrust law, can challenge pretty egregious behavior from utilities where they are cutting out their competition. How can we do that? So the case in Arizona is super interesting. It is actually, the Salt River Project is a public utility, but it's actually been found to operate like an IOU and a corporation. But they essentially, and this is very common. So a lot of people on this call will hear this pattern and it'll ring very true. SRP, Salt River Project, saw that there was a threat to their revenue from rooftop solar because suddenly people are generating our own power and we are biting into their revenue source. So what they did is that they jacked up the rates for rooftop solar customers by 65%. And what that did is it dropped the amount of applications for rooftop solar by 96%. So basically gutted rooftop solar in Arizona in that territory. That is classic anti-competitive behavior under antitrust because you have a company launching an anti-competitive action and literally obliterating the competition. So we used antitrust law in this case. It is right now, very interesting background, but right now it is currently sitting before the Ninth Circuit and we are still waiting for a decision. But if the Ninth Circuit actually finds that, yes, this was antitrust violation, then this can actually open a huge area of case law to use antitrust against utilities and how they are trying to cut out competition.
That's terrific. It's really exciting to hear. Marielle, I want to turn to you. Part of how we've gotten to where we are is we've had a ton of utility mergers over the years. We now have these giant utilities that span multiple states. In some cases, as we learned earlier, owned by big global conglomerates, real lack of accountability to the places that they serve. Your organization challenged a utility merger late last year and won, which is pretty extraordinary. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like what happened and what, sort of the decision that came down. I'm really curious, particularly about like the basis of saying no to this merger. And also, as I understand it, it's the same conglomerate that owns our electric utility in Maine. So a small world.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. Avangrid Iberdrola, yes, the same company that has high rates and the highest forced outage rates, that means brownouts and blackouts in the country, sought to merge with the Public Service Company of New Mexico, that's PNM, in an $8 billion merger. But Avangrid and Iberdrola could not overcome their own track record of outages and unreliability, diminished service quality, more than $63 million in penalties and violations in Maine, in New York, in Connecticut. And they failed to abide by the commission, our commission's own rules and laws. They basically came in and said, we got so much money, kiss the ring right here, we're coming in. And we were like, not so fast. And just one note to activists: to create networks and connect to people nationally and internationally, because Representative Seth Berry was critical. Like he actually wrote an affidavit that we ended up using as part of our fight to actually bring in Iberdrola, the parent company. They wanted to just have Avangrid, but we argued, well, but Iberdrola is like literally pulling the strings. And so it was actually the affidavit, the declaration by Representative Berry that helped win the day in court. The hearing examiner and the commission found that the risks and harms significantly weighed any benefits for ratepayers, which was an enormous, enormous victory. The hearing examiner, some people call them an administrative law judge, and the commission found that the merger was not in the public interest, which essentially, just so you know, is a very low bar. But we worked really hard to show that this company in particular was unworthy of coming into New Mexico. And I'd like to just tell you one important story that really relates to what Jean had said before. Iberdrola and Avangrid testified that their goal was to use PNM as their beachhead. It's a military term to land, and from that landing, attack can be launched. So under cross-examination, the Avangrid CEO admitted that their purpose was to consolidate renewable production for their own financial growth. So it's not, it was not only the extraction of our resources, but literally the export of that money out, not only to Wall Street, but to Spain. So this is exactly what Jean was talking about. They wanted to consolidate the market, get rid of any competition, right? And then jack up rates, and then sell to wherever they wanted. And literally, they said that they chose PNM to get a Southwestern platform in the form of a government-protected monopoly for which they could make further acquisitions and sell our renewable energy for their private profit. Of course, all of us are in favor of renewable energy, which will shortly dominate the grid if we're going to survive, but not for the exploitation of a foreign company with such a bad track record. I just say one last thing is that one of the things that they wanted to do is create these quote baby affiliates that then could buy up all the rest outside of PNM's beachhead. And the commission found that they didn't have the resources to police not only Avangrid PNM, but all those other baby affiliates that they said that they were going to create for the umbrella company, Iberdrola.
Well, congratulations on that. That's really terrific. I'm curious a little bit about the politics sort of around that. I mean, a lot of the utilities, and I think Avangrid did this, in this context, they make promises about, we're going to build a big, renewable, solar renewable power production. We're going to offer this jobs, these sorts of claims. And in some cases, I don't know if this was true in New Mexico, but in some cases, it seems like people get hooked on those ideas and are willing to sort of jettison concerns about ownership, about control, about oversight, sort of all of the democratic kinds of qualities that you're talking about and that emerged in the commission's decision. And I'm just curious how that played out with other organizations and groups in New Mexico.
Well, Avangrid repeatedly said we were the only one who opposed them. Well, we were, and there were a lot of, there were even press people, they were like, Marielle, why are you fighting this? You're going to lose. Money talks. And I said, well, we have to speak the truth and talk about energy democracy, really. And we also brought out a lot of, elicited a lot of evidence. So I'll just give you one example that, made the papers. 3, count them 3, P&M executives stood to make $29 million from the merger. And you compare that to 480,000 residential New Mexican customers, so current P&M customers, and you know what they were going to get? Less than those 3 people, $1.54 a month. So it was that kind of information that we not only elicited, but then we, of course, one of the other things is to take it out of, which Jean is also extremely good and Center for Biological Diversity is, take it out of the little confines of the legal case and to inform and educate people. We were on the front page of the newspapers on a regular basis, sometimes as much as once a week, to talk about these kinds of inequities. And the question really that we should be asking is, we are going to transfer, if we're going to survive, we have to transform the grid, and it's got to be 100% renewable. And we're on the cusp of not only transferring the electric grid for our electricity, but as Representative Berry said, to transform it to meet the transportation needs and the housing sector needs. So we have going to increase renewable usage by a lot. And the question is, are we going to replicate the exact same system of inequity and inequality and of racism, and then literally export the profits to Wall Street at 1%? Or are we going to shift that model? Are we going to have our power and stop the violence? Another point that I made in the hearing, also to Jean Sue's point, was literally the Monday after the hearing was supposed to end, P&M was set to disconnect ratepayers, 21,000 ratepayers from electricity. Meanwhile, they're throwing out millions and billions to the executives and the shareholders. And one of the things what they said was, well, we'll eliminate about half of the COVID disconnect notices. And I literally just asked, why not all of them? You're doing an $8 billion merger. Why not just eliminate the COVID disconnects? And they were just like, we can't do that, And it's that kind of thing over and over and over again. And that's the real day-to-day violence, because when that orange notice comes into your mailbox and you are literally concerned about, should I have food on my table or have electricity? That's not what we want to do for a just society. I just read that during COVID, child poverty, including food insecurity, has gone up. And meanwhile, P&M made $190 million in profit just last year.
Wow. John, I'm going to turn back to you just with a sort of short closing question. As you sort of reflect on these really incredible fights and insights that our panelists have brought today. how do we, what are there transformative ways we can get out of having, sort of constant kind of rear guard fights with utility companies over, in California, there's this big thing around, they're really trying to change the rules of net metering in order to stymie distributed solar. What are kind of, how do we think about this big picture, and how do we sort of move in a way that is more transformative? And I mean that not only in the context of how electricity is structured, but how do we think about some of the points that Marielle and Jean have raised around the ways in which monopoly utilities take advantage of racism and further racism in order to augment their power.
Yeah, I'm going to take a stab at an answer to that question. I just want to emphasize for folks, if you like what you've heard from Marielle or from Jean or from Seth and Rick, all three out of the four have been guests on ILSR podcasts, our Building Local Power or Local Energy Rules podcast, sometimes to talk about the very issues that they were here to join us to talk about today. So if you would like to hear them speak more and at greater length, you can do that on our website. We're a nonprofit, as are many of the groups here. You can donate to help support this great work at ilsr.org/donate. New Energy Economy, the Center for Biological Diversity, or Our Power Maine. Please check out the work that they're doing if you support and like what they're doing. You can do that financially as well as by joining this podcast and learning more about it. To try to tackle that very large question, Stacy, in terms of wrapping up, I think I would just say that this, to go back to my river metaphor, like we have to sort of change the way that the entire system is flowing. We have to, the problem that we have right now, especially with investor-owned utilities, but not solely with them, and as we mentioned before, that we can have even examples of public power that are running in a problematic way, is really, how do we break down the institutional power that these organizations have and disperse it? And Jean, I think, did such a great job of highlighting the importance of antitrust in all of this, that the purpose of that law was to protect our democracy from concentrations of power. And that can be private power, as we have with investor-owned utilities. It can also be public power. And one way we can do that is to not let one entity own everything. Some places they've restructured and already broken apart, like who owns power plants from who owns the distribution system. In some places like New York, they're talking about restructuring how companies earn money. So Rick, I think, mentioned that we have these really high rates of return that are almost guaranteed for monopoly utilities, and we pay them for things we don't want them to do anymore, like build giant power plants. We need to change that. Hawaii has moved to a system of almost entirely performance-based regulation, and it's very new, and we don't know if it's going to work very well, but there's a lot of hope behind that, and at least we're doing the right thing. And then there's what Our Power is trying to do, which is honestly, I think, one of the best things, which is to say, let's break up this utility. Let's create a consumer-owned core of it. And let's also do that with the idea that we're going to allow lots of other entities, not just this utility, to make the decisions about how the system runs. So like lots of folks building rooftop solar or energy storage or homes and businesses, community solar, all of the kinds of things that allow people to make decisions independent of the utility, that shrinks not only like the market share of that utility within the electricity sector, but then all of the political power that comes with that, of having the monopoly, of the relationships with regulators, of the virtually unlimited amount of money they can have for the legal fights against, to promote their own mergers, to reward their executives. All of these things come back to this idea that we've concentrated the power in this market within these particular companies, and we need to attack it directly, and whether that's even just rhetorically, like noting that in these fights in California and saying, look, the utility wants to quash rooftop solar because it's a threat to their market share, to how they make money building transmission lines and building substations and transformers. Those are the things they want to do that they profit from. So of course they're opposed to this. Or by bringing to the table real substantive reforms, like in Hawaii, like in this, it's called a high DER proceeding in California. I don't want to get into the weeds, but talking about how do we restructure the system to reduce the power of those institutions.
That's great. And let's bring back Seth and Rick, and for sort of our final wrap up here. We've got just a few minutes left, but I think I want to ask everyone, sort of what really motivates you? Like, what's sort of one thing that really drives you in this work? What's sort of the vision and thing that really is why you do this? And also, if you could, as a sort of part two of the question, if you could say just something about how people who are in the audience, who are listening today, what's something that they can do to get involved, or an initial step that you can offer them. Rick, let's start with you.
Well, thank you again, Stacy. It's great to be with you. I think I may have hinted at this in the answer to the very first question, but what motivates me is the need for people to be in control in an increasingly volatile world. We need to create structures where people are actually in control, and we can no longer rely on the institutions that historically we've turned to run things for us. And the good news is we don't need to. We have the tools through all of the craziness of today's world involving social media and means of connecting with one another at an individual level, people of shared interest, to work across the usual power structures, across the silos, and share information, share passions and enthusiasms, and get this done. I think we have an opportunity to build a more democratic, small d, future where self-determination is respected, where people are really in charge. But we've also seen the downsides to some of these technologies that are allowing that. So we all have to be vigilant. But that's really what motivates me. And I would say to your second question, people just throw yourselves in, find something worthy, and just get involved with it. I have to tell you, I've learned a lot from Seth Berry. I've learned a lot from a lot of other people because I'm newly back to the legislature. The world has changed a lot in the 20 years since I was gone. But information is very accessible, and it's so easy. In Maine, you raise your hand at the wrong moment, you're elected to the school board. So I just think that it's a great chance for people just to throw yourselves in. And we certainly would love you to throw yourselves in, even remotely, to the Our Power effort. OurPowerMaine.org is where you can connect. Thanks.
That's great, Seth.
Yeah, I feel so many echoes in my head of what Rick just said. I mean, the partnership that this has engendered has been incredibly inspiring. Working with Rick, working with Marielle, with John and Stacy, ILSR has been an incredible partner, and this is building. It's become a movement here in Maine, but I really feel that there's a movement incipient in the U.S. as well. And the industry has its eye on us. They're probably on the line here today. And they want to crush it. But I think we can crush it. I think we can do this. I think we have something that is really that the American people are ready for, and that many communities are eager to take on. There are so many ways into this idea. What I love about working in this space is that our power is about equity, right, and a just transition. It is about anti-monopoly, yes, and self-reliance. It is about climate for sure. That's my number one motivation and sort of entry point for myself. And it's about democracy and a more democratic economy. So every problem that I go to bed at night worrying about, every problem that, when I think about my children, my two sons, and I used to be a teacher, my former students and their children, the next generation, there's so much to worry about for them. And when I go to bed at night and worry about them and their future and what that planet is going to look like and what their democracy is going to look like, I find an answer in this effort and in this partnership with all of you. So I hope people will go to OurPowerMaine.org. That's my ask, and stay on for the after party, because we look forward to trying to answer all of the incredible questions. So many good comments going into the chat and the Q&A. So please stay on with us if you can.
Great, Jean.
There's a lot of promise to this after party, so everybody really should stay on. A lot of hype here. I began my career through climate, working in different parts of Africa and Asia, and I know we have global on the line today, which is amazing. So I take this from a climate standpoint. We really literally only have the next 8 years to significantly, radically change our energy system. And when I came to the States and started working here, I think there is such heartbreak in how racist and violent this energy system is. It is a form of all the societal issues that we face here. So climate justice, the fight for climate justice is the fight for racial justice, for societal justice, for gender justice. And that's what keeps me motivated to do this work. And we have to keep going because we have no choice. And I think for those who want to get involved, you can actually start right now to figure out your energy system and how to change it. This isn't about decarbonization. This is about the whole picture. So get on in and do it, whatever angle it is, and run, right? You have Representative Berry here and Senator Bennett. Run and make a change so that you can be the decision maker instead of all of us trying to get decision makers to do the right thing.
I love that. Marielle.
So dare to struggle, dare to win. Courage is contagious. You know, once you start fighting, then people want to be and join. And, you know, I was texting Representative Berry, and I would tell him when we got something good that happened. He's like, you go, you know, I mean, I have to just tell you, that's love, you know, and I've never met Representative Berry. But what does Cornel West say? That justice is love made public. That's what we're after, you know? And I just want to say that I got into this because I was thinking, I used to do police misconduct work, not a light subject, right? But I found out, I knew about climate, but I didn't understand the urgency. This is now 15 years ago. And I thought, how can I look at my kids in their eyes and say I didn't do what I knew how to do? And so what I'm asking you all out there who are listening is, I don't know what your talent is. What are you passionate about? And what can you bring? Are you a pianist? Are you a painter? Are you a great computer graphic artist? Are you a writer? What do you know how to do? We need you. We need you. This fight is big enough to include your talents. It's about getting involved, and it's about making your family bigger than your nuclear family. It's about making your family our movement family to create justice in the world. Thank you so much.
I am so energized after hearing all of you and incredible work. I mean, it's remarkable what's going on. I want to thank you, all of our panelists, for participating. I want to thank everyone who turned out in the audience. You know, if you want to stay connected to ILSR, I encourage you to sign up for one of our newsletters. I'll drop that in the chat. As John mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization, so all of this work is made possible through donations. And so, and you can follow us on social media, but please do engage if you'd like to be involved, both in our energy work and in the anti-monopoly work we do across different sectors of the economy and in building local power at the community level. And please do stay on for the after party. We barely scratched the surface. There are some incredible questions, and I'm so sorry we just didn't get into, there's so many interesting issues in the questions. As John mentioned, our podcasts are a great way to hear from all of these panelists if you dig back through the archives and go into more detail. But we'll also have a chance right now in conversation with Seth and Rick and anyone else who can stay along. And so with that, let me thank everyone again and close the official part of this event, and we will now transition to the after party. Thanks, and Seth and Rick, I'm gonna hand control over the Q&A and the moderating to you at this point. So
that's a dangerous thing, Stacey. We'll just provide a disclaimer that from here on out, ILSR has nothing to do with it. So, you know, you can't blame them. Thanks, everyone. We really look forward to the after party. Please do stay on. Otherwise, keep in touch at ourpowermain.org. And of course, go to ILSR and support them. We're so grateful for today and all of their work.
Amen.
So I think as people stay or don't stay, I'll just kind of begin with some brief introductions and introductory remarks. I know that Senator Bennett only has another 15 minutes or so with us, so I want to really focus our time with him and take full advantage of his perspective. He brings a really important and unique value to this effort. We do have some others joining us, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from them as well. But there's so many questions in the chat, and there's so many comments. And Leah, I don't know if you're able to see them already, but I'll just introduce you quickly. Leah Henry is our finance coordinator from Our Power. We are also joined by John Brodegam and Gary Friedman, two of our board members. And Rick is a lead petitioner in the Citizen Initiative. So I think, although you're seeing just a very small slice of our organization's leadership, and unfortunately a largely male slice, you have us for a little while. Rick first, and I just want to say, Leah, do you see anything that Rick could or actually, tell you what, Leah, while you're looking at the questions, Rick, you've probably had a chance. Do you have some things that you want to answer, to add, to enrich the discussion with? Because I know my head is just percolating with things I'd like to say, so I'm sure yours is too.
Yeah, this is going to.
Rick,
Oh,
do you mind
Leah.
if I just jump in for just 1 second? I'll give you 2 more seconds to think about that answer.
Please.
If any, the folks that are with us for this after party, I wish I had a disco ball or something behind me, but if you could go ahead, if you are here, an attendee, and would like to have a question answered, if you could just go ahead and put that back into the Q&A. I know Our Power questions are all the way up at the top at the start of this, so just go ahead and type your question in again so that I can see it a little bit more readily, and then we'll get those questions going.
That's a great idea.
You, Senator Rick Bennett.
Excellent. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you for all you do for the movement. The thing I wanted to say is that, generally, honestly, the greatest skepticism on this that I've heard comes from people in my own party, and I think there's some issues there that ought to be addressed, because as we're all going out in our communities and talking about this concept, there is some skepticism about this, and I think a lot of that can be addressed if you look at the materials and the information that is available on our website. But I honestly, when I started talking with Republican groups about my support for this, I got some pushback, but surprisingly little, partly because CMP, which serves my constituents, or endeavors to at some level, is miserable, and they've been absolutely horrible in their customer service. We've had a series of billing disputes, metering issues, lack of reliability, and they say, well, Maine is a difficult place to do business because we've got lots of trees. Well, there's a lot of trees in Washington County, Maine, and yet the consumer-owned utility up there seems to do quite well and much better on reliability. So I think, first of all, in Maine, because of the abysmal performance of the incumbent investor-owned utilities, people are a little bit more sensitized to hear the argument. But of course, the other side immediately launched a multi-million-dollar misinformation campaign about what we're trying to do, predicated on 2 lies right up front. First of all, that this is about government takeover of the grid, and secondly, that you're going to be on the hook as a taxpayer. And both of those are just totally wrong. They're flat out mistruths. And as we talked about, this is about a consumer ownership model where ratepayers, the people of Maine, are in charge, not through the governmental agencies, not through governmental authority, but through a not-for-profit. And there is no tax money involved. There is revenue bonds that are going to fund this. And I think the argument, a lot of the arguments I hear from more conservative Republican audiences are based on these mistruths. So the first thing I have to do is talk about them. But then the other thing that's true here that I think particularly resonates in our case is that these investor-owned utilities are literally agents of foreign governments. One of them is actually, the ratepayers in Bangor, Maine, pay their rates, and the profits from their electric utility goes to pave streets and sidewalks in Calgary, Canada. It leaves one scratching your head. The other thing is that CMP, as mentioned, is owned by Iberdrola. Their chairman has been indicted in Spain for political corruption. And the owners of the company it's a public company, and most of the ownership is, the largest owners are the government of Norway and the government of Qatar. So Republicans, conservatives, I think people of all stripes really don't understand how we ended up there. How did we end up with our critical infrastructure? Critical for national security reasons, critical for our energy future, owned by people that have no interest in this except for investment returns, and in foreign lands. And so I think we need to think about among our enthusiasms for this great idea, we need to think about how it's being perceived in the context in which it comes, and particularly try to reach across the spectrum, the political spectrum, to talk with all people about the importance of taking control back of our electric grid.
That's great, Senator Bennett, and what you spoke about, I think really resonates with me. I represent a pretty conservative district. I was attracted to this issue in part because consumer-owned utilities are so prevalent in the heartland, in very conservative parts of the country. And it got me thinking, this kind of works, and that actually goes for parts of Maine as well. The 77 or so towns served by the Down East Cooperative, the largest of our consumer-owned utilities here are it's a pretty conservative area. So I think that critical infrastructure piece is very important. Who should own our critical infrastructure, right? And one thing we haven't mentioned as well is that in our proposal, we have a private sector operator. So there's actually a competitive bid process for the operations of the utility, right? And that operating company keeps the workers in the private sector, which they prefer. So that's a benefit as well. But there is a free market in our proposal, but there is no free market now, right? There's no free market in a monopoly. So we're taking we're opening up a space for free market where we have none now. That, it seems to me, is also important. But I do think the national security argument, the critical infrastructure piece, is perhaps where we get the biggest traction in talking with our Republican friends. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that is something that everybody should understand, but it underscores the more essential question, which is the one of self-determination, and who is this critical infrastructure really serving?
Yeah, so powerful.
By the way, I see a question here. I know I just wanted to answer it because it's a quick one. John Bailey asked about the ballot language. In Maine, you have to have the ballot language in advance of getting one signature on, and you have to actually staple it to the petition sheet so that people can be sure to have access to read it if they wish. And so it's not a terribly long bill, frankly. It is a piece of legislation. What is it, 6 or 7 pages long, and it's available on the Our Power Maine website too, ourpowermaine.org website.
Amen. And Leah, in looking over the questions, have you seen any others that you might want to direct to Senator Bennett before he has to go?
Well, I think you both touched on this a little bit. We have a few questions about workers and worker unions, one specifically about our strategy for overcoming potential tensions with worker unions and forming really a labor climate solidarity in the public power organizing.
Yeah, so important. And it's worth noting that there are concerns from line workers. They are not uniformly excited about this idea. And I think there are a couple of ways that we've been very strategic and thoughtful about how we approach that. One concern that they have is that while a private sector worker in any part of the country does have the right to strike, a public sector worker may not. And in Maine, generally speaking, public sector workers do not have the right to strike. So there's a concern there. And I mentioned that we made this it is a private operations company that they would be working for. And that management team that comes in and oversees the workers would be doing so based on a competitive bid, having won that contract for a fixed period, perhaps with an option to extend based on performance. But they would be private sector workers. So they would have the right to strike. And we additionally provided some backup language that shores that up, that provides additional insurance. We feel very strongly about our workers, our line workers are critically important. We want them to be Maine-based jobs, to be union jobs. A concern that our unions have here is that much of the work, if not most of it, in fact, is being contracted out to non-union shops. And so we prevent that in the proposal. And I think that perhaps is the biggest benefit to the union line workers. And I hope that they fully understand that. But I'll be honest, the relationship between union leaders and management is a close one. It's a little bit like the regulator and the utilities, right? They spend a lot of time together. So I don't know that we can fully permeate that and fully guarantee that we're going to have the unions 100% behind this. We did have some opposition, in fact. And part of that was because there was a benefit offered by management, which was conditional. And we actually saw the utility here say, I tell you what, guys, we'll give you everything you wanted, all those new bucket trucks, all those new positions, if you just agree not to speak in favor of this bill. And long story short, the business manager for the union did that. And we were not able to have their support. We actually had it at first and then lost it because of that. So I don't honestly know that we will be able to create a perfect union there. But I think once we have made this change, the business model will speak for itself, and the provisions that we have in the bill will work as intended. The last thing I'll mention is that the workers for consumer-owned utilities right now, in the larger consumer-owned utility areas, which are more comparable, seem to be doing very well. I'm very interested if people have connections to some of that data, to learning more about it. How are people paid and how are the unions faring at Sacramento Municipal Utility District, at Los Angeles, at the other large COUs around the country, because that is an area where I think we could use some additional data and some additional support and connections. So I'll leave it there. Leah, what else do you have?
We've got some technical questions. Here's one: unless the new COU wants to rebuild the infrastructure, how do you compel the sale of existing distribution system assets by the IOU?
Yes, that's a critical question. And Rick, since I know you have to go soon, I'm going to hand that to you, and any concluding remarks as well, and then we can finish.
Sure. Thanks so much, Seth, and thank you, everybody. In Maine, there is conditional. This is a regulated monopoly, as we know, and in Maine, in theory, that monopoly franchise can be revoked by the PUC. Unhappily, in current law, there is no standards that are given to the PUC by which they could take that action. So within the legislation that was both passed in the legislature, enacted in the legislature, and the legislation which is moving forward now, there is a finding of what constitutes performance standards for the investor-owned utilities. And it looks back over a 5-year period what those perform and how they performed, and they just don't meet them. And they're actually pretty reasonable performance standards. You can see them in the bill, and you can ask yourself if you think that they're reasonable performance standards. But they have to do largely with reliability, customer confidence, and those sorts of issues, which are directly related to the work that they're supposed to be doing for the people of Maine. They have abysmally failed on those standards, and so we do. Therefore, then you can't just make that finding and then not have an avenue by which the franchise, once taken away, is left in the ether sphere somewhere. We need to have a solution, and so the rest of the bill is about the construction of the consumer-owned utility model, so that we have a place that those assets will move. And so it is consistent in current law with that. It's kind of a development beyond current law with respect to the power to revoke the monopoly franchise. Again, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for coming. Even in the after party, we've got great attendance, I see, more than 150 people, and that's really encouraging. It's going to inspirit all of our volunteers in Maine who are working hard, and will be throughout the cold winter months up here collecting signatures and doing the work. As Seth said, we're very close. Candidly, we could use your help if you want to come and for a nice, February vacation in Maine and gather signatures for a week. Would love that. If you can send us a few dollars through the webpage, that would be great too, to help us keep moving this along. ourpowermaine.org. And I just want to, in closing, just say, what an honor it's been. I see a lot of comments in the chat here about my colleague, Representative Berry. He's a remarkable leader, and we're of different parties, as you know, but it's been a joy and an honor working with you, Seth, and the rest of the team, but particularly you and your steady, able leadership on this issue. And I'm glad to see that's recognized by so many people in the chat from all across the country. And I appreciate your leadership in Maine and also nationally on this. So thank you all for coming, and appreciate everything you're doing.
Rick, thank you very much for being with us for the first part of the after party. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you tomorrow to plan our broadband caucus. Rick and I are co-chairs of the broadband caucus in the legislature. So on to the next topic soon. Good to see you. And Leah, you're gonna hit us with another question or two. I can't believe the incredible comments and questions in the chat and the Q&A. I have to appreciate one of them, which comes from someone who seems to have a Spanish background, living in Spain, and I have some relatives in Barcelona. I've had some unique perspective about our utility. Our larger utility, Central Maine Power, owned by Avangrid, which also tried to buy the utility in New Mexico that Marielle told us about. They're really a corker. Iberdrola, we're only 2% of Iberdrola's holdings, but they have expanded to a multinational empire. And they actually, as the commenter seemed to indicate, they have a history that originated in the fascist regime of Francisco Franco. And they helped actively to create that regime and to prop up Franco. It's really a remarkable history, and we don't talk about it much here in Maine. We just talk about reliability and costs, but there's more to it. I just want to quickly share the screen because I think that there is a useful thing there's a lot of useful things on our website, but one that I just want to point out to folks briefly is right here. I think you can see it now. So the JD Power electric utility residential customer satisfaction study is conducted every year. It's really the gold standard. Central Maine Power 20 years ago used to brag about their high rankings, and it's done by region, so it's hard to see the national picture. But we have an expert consultant who worked with us, pulled in all of the regional rankings and scores and compiled them nationally. So there are 142 large and mid-sized utilities in the US. those 142 large and mid-sized utilities ranked by score, and you see for the number one ranking here is a score of 824. That's on a 1,000-point scale for customer satisfaction. Of all of those utilities, the top 5 were all consumer-owned utilities, munis, or in one case, state. And that's a pretty remarkable thing, considering that only 28% of Americans are served by consumer-owned utilities. So there's some there. It makes you scratch your head and wonder, oh, okay, so why is it that 5 out of 100, all the top 5 out of 142 are consumer-owned? And then if you go down to the bottom of the 142, you find that the lowest ranking are utilities. All of them are investor-owned utilities. And just to really cap it off, you see Maine's utilities at the very, very bottom of that list. Central Maine Power, the worst of the worst, with 647 points. And Versant, our other large, more of a mid-sized utility, but our other investor-owned utility here in Maine, in fourth place, tied for fourth to last, with Pacific Gas and Electric, which I saw some nice comments in the chat earlier about them. That's, of course, the company that pled guilty to killing 85 of its customers in the Camp Fire in California, and went bankrupt twice in the last 20 years. And I agree, Jim, that bankruptcies, I saw a question from Jim, bankruptcies are a really good opportunity to restructure, to municipalize or convert to consumer ownership. And I don't know why that is not done more often. There was a really big missed opportunity in the PG&E case. There were, I think, over 30 municipal and county officials who attempted to convince the governor to make that happen. But Governor Newsom chose not to go forward with it. And I think that was a real missed opportunity out there. I'm going to stop sharing, but I just wanted you to see that. And there's so much else on the website. Please do go there and take a look. Donate up the top left, take action. You can sign up to help, and lots more. So with that, Leah, what else do you have for us?
Great, thanks, Seth. Well, since it's the 4 of us, John, Gary, Seth, and myself, the part of the Our Power team here, I thought I would ask the question. A couple folks are asking, how to get involved in this, whether you're local in Maine or national. We have a question: can local letters to our papers help encourage interest in owning our own electric company? So switching to a consumer-owned utility. And I thought, lots of us on this call right now could probably jump in and share different ways to get involved.
Yeah, let me toss that question to John and Gary. And I should say, John and Gary have been with us from the start. They come from a deep background in energy work here in Maine and in democracy work here in Maine. And of course, these two things intersect around this issue. So we're really, really lucky to have them. Local leaders, former legislators, board directors, both of them incredible leaders in their own right. And they're just a small showing of our team here. Thanks for jumping on, guys. And does one of you want to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I would say that our goal here is not to necessarily get a certain number of signatures and not even to win something at the ballot. It's more transformational than that, and it's more long-term than that. This is an effort that's not going to finish in the next few years. It's going to take a while, and at the base of it all is educating the public that what they're accustomed to is not the only way to do this, and in fact, there's a much better way to do it. So that gets around to what people can do. I mean, I think it's going to take one-on-one conversations with people sharing this idea, and your interest and curiosity and commitment to this idea with your networks, and those people sharing it with their networks. It's gonna really need to come from the very, very grassroots and reach throughout the state. Unfortunately, we have a little over 1 million people in Maine. There's precedence for this kind of campaign, really going door to door and really communicating at a very personal one-on-one levels, which parts of these, which benefits of the COU model are the most appealing to you and why. And that can be letters to the editor, It can be op-eds, it can be house parties, it can be something you mentioned in a holiday letter. It can be anything, but we're starting at the very, very grassroots, and this is a very long-term campaign, and we're trying to win everybody's hearts and minds.
I might just add that this is really a citizens effort, that we just filed our quarterly ethics commission report where we show contributions and expenditures, and we had 500 contributions, almost all of them from Maine, and raising a couple $100,000. The opposition had one contribution of over $1 million from CMP, which is basically ratepayer funded. So not only do we need lots of volunteers, which you can sign up for on the website, but we welcome all those small contributions. And those hundreds of volunteers that have been working over the last 3 months to collect signatures, and we've collected almost 50,000 signatures, with most of them from our 250 volunteers out there. And we still need another 20,000, but we're going to get those in the next couple months. And I think that's, part of what John's saying is that it's that one-on-one and the hundreds of people that are rising up to reclaim our power that are going to turn our situation around here.
It is absolutely critical that we network across the country. We are very interested in connecting with you if you're from outside of Maine and you're working on some effort in another part of the country. And we owe it to places that have gone before us, whether it was the state of Nebraska in the 1930s that helped to inspire us, or a more recent example, Winter Park, Florida, or Jefferson County, Washington, or Pittsburgh in the case of water, or Chattanooga in the case of telecommunications. Municipalizations work, and we have seen successful transitions in all of those instances. But we also know that there's a very powerful vested interest that opposes these sorts of proposals. And what is unique about our proposal is that we're trying to create a climate and consumer friendly, democratized grid, not just in one small community or even a city, like Chattanooga, but in an entire state. That is what is new and transformative about this proposal, in addition to the specific design pieces. But this is an incredible opportunity to prove the concept, right? To say that this kind of utility, this approach, this business model is transformative, that can lead to a full, fast, fair, and friendly transition, is a successful way to challenge equity, to deal with monopoly, to confront the climate emergency, to create democracy. And so if you're inspired by our work, we ask you to join us, to participate in whatever way you can. And if you're working on the issue in Michigan, a great way to help yourself to do that is to help us make sure that Maine's effort is successful, because we have a unique opportunity here. We have the least popular utility in the country. We're a small state, so we have a very inexpensive media market, and people are ready for this. Our polling shows very strong support, more than 2-to-1 support across the board here in Maine. So in some respects, if you're looking to do it if you're inspired by this, if you're looking to do it in your area, counterintuitively, perhaps one of the best ways you can do that is to help us here in Maine. We want to help you and network and help you lay the groundwork. But if we are successful, that will become your success. If we are unsuccessful, that will become your challenge. So, go to ourpowermaine.org, participate in whatever way you can, and we want to communicate and help you with your efforts as well in other parts of the country. Leah, what's the best way that people can participate, by the way? Maybe just put something in the chat. Would that be helpful if they want to join in and keep in touch with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put our link down here for Take Action, and you can always find us on ourpowermaine.org. There is the donate button right up in the corner. We really appreciate your support. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you.
That's
Go
great.
ahead and put that.
So yeah, please put, if you can participate in any way, I'm going to ask you this right now. Put your name in the chat. Maybe just say where you're from. It could be Newport, Maine, or it could be Newport, Rhode Island, wherever you're from, and tell us also how you'd like to participate. You want to You want to network? Do you have some connections you want to offer? Do you have a question you want to ask us? Will you be able to make a donation? We'd like to kind of recognize you as we go through the remainder of this after party. So please put that in the chat. Your name, well, that'll be there. So just where you're from and how you can participate, or how you'd like to participate. Great, Bill is already jumping in. Thank you very much. So I should mention too, and we'll go to other questions, Leah. Nice to see some additional things popping up in the chat. I should mention that Maine has a history of going first on exciting and transformative initiatives. You know, John and Gary were very involved in the effort to create the Maine the Maine Clean Elections program. That was done by ballot initiative and helped to take money out of politics, and was it was that kind of transformative ballot, citizen initiative that shows that Maine can be a proving ground for something. A lot of other states have since followed suit. Marriage equality, raising the minimum wage. What am I forgetting, guys? Ranked choice voting. Right? The bottle bill back in the 70s, right? All of these were done by citizen initiative in Maine, and it really is a ripe proving ground for new ideas that maybe need to be trialed somewhere, and that are maybe a little too progressive for the or innovative for the heavily lobbied legislatures and state houses. So that is also something we want you to know. Maine is a place that can do this, and it can help you in that way by proving the concept. Great to see these comments in the chat. Leo,
yeah.
What do you see?
One more technical question. If we want to maybe start to close out on that. Sean and David asking similar questions. How would a new ownership structure address the fundamental and technically based problems that are preventing more distributed getting connected to?
Boy, I think that is so important. And I just want to acknowledge something. There are fundamental technical based problems that you just need really, really good people for, right? You really need to have the very best and brightest to look at laminar grid architecture, right? I mean, grid modernization and the reshaping of our whole energy system is very much a technical challenge. So I think having the best people, whether you're an investor-owned utility or a consumer-owned utility, is incredibly important. Having good regulators, good policymakers, the populace paying attention, helping people to become energy literate. These are all things that you can do regardless of the business model. But here's the thing: if you have a business model which, as I mentioned before, puts people first and not profits, there's no perverse incentive to gold plate the grid, which is what our current system unfortunately requires, right? The Hope and the Bluefield standards of that were set by the Supreme Court back in the early part of the 20th century require that we compensate utilities based on capital expenditures, and that becomes the driver. So there's a very perverse set of incentives, and we remove that perverse incentive. I think that is incredibly powerful. And we also, in our proposal, create a mission statement, which is very much about climate, connectivity, and making a just and equitable transition, which includes rates and reliability, right? So I don't know if Gary or John, do you want to add anything? Okay. Leo, boy, look at these comments pouring into the chat. Just great. I look forward to following up with all these folks. And Leah, you're recording that, right? That's going to be
oh yes, yep, absolutely.
There for posterity. Okay, excellent.
Say the same thing, Seth. The chat has been continuously moving down and down with more folks wanting to get involved in it. Looks like a really good stretch of both local and national. So we really do appreciate that support, and we've got lots of ways to be involved.
We sure do.
Yep.
You can donate to the C3 effort or the C4 if you are interested in donating. The C3, of course, is tax deductible. That is done through ILSR as our fiscal sponsor, and we're very grateful to them for that. The C4 is very helpful. You don't get the tax deduction, but it's the most flexible money and can be used in the most overtly political ways, which is, of course, a part of what we need to do. So what other questions do you see, Leah?
Great. I've got one here. I think it's really a question about how to move away from the reliance on oil and the gas industries for decades. Obviously, job transitioning will be a big part of it, but I think also just generally changing people's minds about what we've had for so long.
That's great. Gary or John, do you want to take that? So, Leah, repeat the question for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So the direct question is, where do we begin to demonopolize in a state that has relied on the oil and gas industry for decades? It seems like job transition has to be a major consideration, and I would extend it to just generally, how do we move away from that, and how does a COU partake in that?
I almost want to take that from the very local. So did they say what state they're from?
It did not actually say what state.
Because it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the states that are most, most producing oil and gas, and I don't know if they meant that kind of dependence on oil and gas, are states where there's a long history of consumer ownership, right? More than half of the geography, the square miles of this country, are actually served by consumer-owned utilities because of the co-ops that finally brought power in the 1930s and 40s and 50s to the most rural parts of the state. The farmers didn't have power. The co-ops made that possible, and the Rural Electrification Act. So it's what I think is fascinating is that in many heavily oil and gas and coal producing states, they get it. They understand consumer ownership already. Nebraska, fully consumer owned. They also have some of they have the very best reliability, despite the tornadoes out there, which are the reason I don't live there. And also they have some of the cheapest power, which is important in a just transition, right? If you want to, we're going to put everyone on electric heat pumps and vehicles, and we need it to be affordable. So, you look at other parts of the country, in the Midwest, in the heartland, it's a very well understood model. And what else, guys? What else?
I might just add to this that I came into Our Power from the grassroots, working to establish community-based solar, community-based conservation projects, community-based electric vehicle adaptation. And, I think that in terms of demonopolizing, that it has to work both ways. Having community-based solar arrays, cooperatively owned, which Scott Flan, I see, mentioned, that's happening in the Oxford Hills. Those kind of things are ways of demonopolizing and regaining local control of our energy. And what we found here in Bar Harbor, where we tried to do that on Mount Desert Island, is that we couldn't actually achieve that, given the investor-owned utilities that were not interested in interconnecting our systems, not interested in helping us with electric vehicle charging stations, not interested in helping us develop a microgrid so that we could become more energy independent. So that's why we're working at it from the statewide level down, as well as from the community level up.
I would only add that, in the sectors that are competitive, that are supposed to be designed to be competitive, that you have to ensure that the competitive marketplace actually works, and that there isn't an aggregation of market power, and you need a regulatory structure for that. In the sectors that are not intended to be competitive, that are intended to be monopolies, you need to make sure that the monopoly that's in place is set up with the right incentives, that the incentives are going to drive that monopoly to perform in the way that returns the best benefit for that monopoly. And right now, we don't have the right incentives in place. We have incentives that are structured to enhance the profitability of the monopoly at the expense of the investments that they should be making in the services for the people of the state. So those incentives are always have to be examined. I don't know what state this question's coming from, but where you have a regulated monopoly, you have to have the right incentive structures, and you have to periodically re-examine those incentive structures because they shift. There's regulatory co-optation. There's all kinds of things that happen from decade to decade, and you can't assume that the incentive structures continue to serve their original purpose.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is that some believe that the Public Utility Commission, that regulatory structure is an effective check on the investor-owned utilities. But in fact, in most states, including in Maine, the Public Utilities Commission has been captured by the investor-owned utilities. They're in front of those regulators all the time and are not going to be the source of our being able to decarbonize the grid, to integrate more renewable energy, to develop microgrids. They're just not very helpful in that way. So that's another reason why I got involved with Our Power, was to flip that model. It's not enough that renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuels, or that it's technologically possible for our island communities to develop microgrids. They won't happen unless we take control of our utilities, which are standing in the way every day from this happening.
So I see a lot of questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, and I just want to thank everyone for those. If you didn't get that answered, do us a favor and put it in the chat, move it over to the chat, because I think, Leah, that's what you're able to monitor best. Is that right? And
yeah, and I think also the chat will be saved, so we can always reach out as well and make sure that we get those questions answered. I do have one last question, maybe, Seth. I saw one earlier about how renters and property owners could come together in this fight to fight for a community-owned utility. And then, somewhat related, we have a question here about, maybe when will we see the ability to plug in our EVs, to our homes during power outages? And I don't know if that would be one of our final questions, but curious to know if there's an answer there.
We are near the top of the hour, so we probably do need to start wrapping it up. Make sure you put your contact information in the chat, or excuse me, your how you want to participate, and we will follow up with you. I think we do have contact information at this point for folks, and we'll touch base with you offline. But EVs and the interconnected grid of the future where you are not just a consumer but also at the same time a producer. Maybe it's through storage in your EV, or your hot water heat pump is actually participating in a peak shaving aggregated demand program. Maybe you're off the grid entirely, but more likely you're connected and you're really participating as what they call a prosumer. That's coming, and we need to accelerate that transition. That can't come soon enough, frankly. We need to modernize the grid. We need to democratize the grid. We need to make it more affordable, and above all, we need to make it more renewable. So,
hey, Seth, I want to just take a minute to answer Linda Dean's question about unions being used. That I think this is a really important piece, that our initiative, the bill to create a Pine Tree Power Company, the COU, requires that union workers be utilized in this work. And we need to just make it really clear that this is a pro-union, a pro-local jobs bill.
Very much so. And anyone who says otherwise hasn't read it carefully enough. But I think the point that I was trying to make earlier, perhaps clumsily, is that the business model matters. Is the business model everything? No. You need to have good laws and good people around it. But if you don't have the right business model, it becomes much harder. There are communities that are just now realizing that because they have a consumer-owned utility, they have the power to do really big things really quickly. And that's what our moment in history calls for. So if you happen to live in a part of the country that already has a consumer-owned utility, get involved, run for the board, show up at their meetings, hold them accountable, turn them around, make them decarbonize. Or maybe you're lucky enough to already be there, because they are the leaders right now if you look and survey the scene across the country. But the rest of us, the other 72% of Americans who don't yet have a consumer-owned utility, we need that too. And we believe that with your support for Our Power and with this coalition working together across the state and beyond, that we can make Maine a proving ground and a place where our mission, frankly, is to do this, where we become the first state in the nation to fully and equitably decarbonize. And I emphasize fully, and that's not without the creative accounting, right? A full, fast, and fair transition. So, we think that this is the opportunity to get there. Now is the time. Maine is in a truly unique position, and we're really grateful for your interest, your attention today. John, do you want to say anything in closing, since you haven't spoken?
No, just to thank you all, and we look forward to hearing how this success that we're going to have here in Maine gets replicated around the country.
Amen. How about you, Gary?
Just thank you everyone for being here. It's been a great afternoon, and we're excited to get to the ballot in November 23. We're going to win this.
Amen. Thank you all for your attention. Thanks again to ILSR and everyone that tuned in today. Be in touch with us through the website, ourpowermaine.org. Thank you, Leah. And onward. We're very grateful, and we look forward to the partnership. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.